Hello, welcome everyone to this session entitled the Retail Reboot. My name is Peter Giuliano. I'm the Chief Research Officer for the Specialty Coffee Association, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to the next speaker. His name is William Bill Murray, and he's the CEO and President of the National Coffee Association. National Coffee Association is a long-standing organization, the longest standing organization in the United States representing the coffee industry, and they do many activities to support the coffee industry, particularly though, and especially to what Bill's going to be discussing today. Since 1950, they've done a study that's now called the National Coffee Data Trends Study, which collects information from consumers about coffee consumption, coffee attitudes, etc. And it's the biggest and most significant ongoing study on coffee consumption that I know of. So it's really fantastic work, and I'm extremely grateful to the National Coffee Association for this work. I'm also very pleased to say that this year, the Specialty Coffee Association started collaborating with the National Coffee Association on this study. So, but it and that collaboration is leading to more insights for the specialty coffee community and the specialty coffee business. So, but there's lots to learn for specialty coffee and non-specialty coffee businesses alike in this study. So, with that, let's see if Bill is going to join me here, is able to join me with his camera. There he is. Hey, Bill.
Hey, Peter. How are you?
Really well. Thanks for taking the time, and I'm looking forward to your talk.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Peter, I'd like to not only thank you, but everybody at the Specialty Coffee Association and Giannis. As you mentioned, we're collaborating on this research now, and I'm really excited about what this means in terms of where we can take the research, but also in terms of a much overused word. We talk a lot about synergy, but I think there really is genuine synergy between the SCA and the NCA, like two circles in a Venn diagram, if you will.
Absolutely.
So thank you. Really
Great.
appreciate this.
Thanks.
So normally when these types of presentations are teed up, it's almost become a cliche. It's been a challenging year. Well, hopefully we can really get to some key issues about coffee. And I'm going to start by blowing up the cliche. It hasn't been a challenging year. It's been a horrific year. I mean, let's face it, 500,000 of our countrymen have lost their lives, our families, our neighbors, and in the course of this, not to diminish anything here, but entire businesses have been completely destroyed. Some people have lost their livelihoods, and if you look at some of the coverage over what's been happening in the retail space, you think it was the end of the world completely, and it's been pretty grim. I mean, not to overlook that. But even as we look at some of these headlines and what's been happening, there's another perspective. And the other perspective is that some of us have found a way to be really successful, that we're thriving. We found our niches. I looked at this saying here that Frida Kahlo is famous for saying. If you know anything about Frida, she was married to Diego. Maybe the nicest thing to say is he wasn't an easy man. She had a number of really severe and debilitating physical limitations, medical conditions. And so, Frida Kahlo says we can get through this, but I think, we can look a little deeper and look past these headlines. Is it the end of coffee? Are we going to thrive? Where are we going to go? So maybe we can look at some of the experts, McKinsey, the great management consultants, the gurus. They issued a report not too long ago, and they said behavior changes, consumers in the pandemic, these behavior changes, they're not linear. and their stickiness will depend on the satisfaction of new experiences. Well, actually, I don't really buy that completely. I mean, and I'm not picking on our friends in the UK, so before you write to me, that was a convenient headline here. We've seen these types of numbers in the US in a number of places. People stop buying toothbrushes and deodorant and putting on makeup. Are they satisfied with those experiences? Is it convenient? Are they sloppy? Are they depressed? There's a lot of things that go into this. We're emotional creatures, right? So I don't think all of this, all these consumer changes can be reduced to any one or any simple thing. The question we really want to ask is, what's that intersection between coffee drinkers, their new habits, their perspectives, and retail coffee? Now, normally in a presentation, especially if we were in person, I would take you through each of my observations, each of the little bits of research and data, and build up to the conclusion. I've got a lot of data to show you today, but we're in a different environment. I think one of the realities is we want to get to the chase quickly, right? There's a lot going on. You're in a different office environment. So hopefully, if I tell you the end of this story, you'll stick around to see how we got there. So let me tell you what the end looks like. I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic about coffee, about specialty coffee, about retail coffee. And I'm optimistic, not just because I want to be optimistic or I think it's a good way to be, but because we have extensive research, which gives us a lot of reasons for optimism. And I'm going to share all of these with you. What does our research tell us? Over 2/3 of coffee shop customers are back or they're anticipating coming back. It's the other 30% roughly that are going to be a challenge. We're going to have to work hard to get them back. And this is according to the research that's out there, okay? But ultimately, when you talk to coffee drinkers, as we do through our research, they tell us that they miss coffee shops. They miss the experience. They want to come back. So if you look back at what McKinsey was saying a moment ago, whatever else is happening, there's that emotional connection that consumers want with their coffee, with the old way that they were drinking coffee. Now, I'm going to telegraph a little bit what I think is the key to getting these people back. And we're going to go into specifics on the research, as I mentioned, in a minute. But the key to getting these other 30% of people back is going to be education, it's going to be communication, and it's going to be your relationship with your customer. And the good news is when it comes to specialty and retail in particular, these are strengths. These are great strengths of retail specialty. I know my barista. She knows what I like to drink. I miss her. I miss seeing her. So these are built-in opportunities that are just waiting to be had. So what we're going to do today, as we dig into the research and the time that we have, we're going to set some baselines. We're going to talk about what the research is telling us about overall consumption, some of the basics, penetration, what percentage of people are drinking coffee, what they're drinking, when they're drinking it, where they're drinking it. We're going to connect this information, what we see, to the financial situation of coffee drinkers. And I can't stress this enough. And that, of course, is related to workplace and the changes that we've seen economically. We're going to talk about some of the things that we're seeing more of, and these things are probably fairly obvious: low touch, more grocery channels, more online. And we're going to talk about some of the opportunities. What are consumers telling us about what they want? And then finally, we're going to talk about what we call perceptions and claims. Issues like living income for coffee farmers, or coffee and health, people's perceptions about coffee, and the claims that we can make in the business. So let's do some level setting. Let's talk about this research. As Peter mentioned a moment ago, since 1950, we here at the National Coffee Association have been commissioning this survey. We've been here since 1911. So I guess we were a little bit late in getting started with the research. Traditionally, we have done one very large piece of research every year. Very, very rich, very extensive, something we could remine over and over again. But last year, something unfortunate happened, right? We did our field work in January, as we normally do. It takes a couple of months to put this together. We top-lined the results at our March convention, the first week in March, and then pretty much the world shut down. And suddenly we were asking ourselves the question, is this research even relevant anymore, given what was happening? So we did something different. We commissioned a second survey last year for the first time ever. In the late summer, we went out with a specific focus on those types of questions that would indicate behavioral changes as a result of the pandemic. And then in January of this year, we did our annual survey once again. And one of the lessons that we learned is once a year is not enough. So we are now routinely going to at least be doing 2 surveys a year. And as Peter mentioned, we'll be working with the SCA to learn more about specialty and to work more closely. Now, if you're a statistician, if you're a data geek, if you're a hardcore business person, this is the stuff that you love. And if you're not, this is where your eyes might glaze over. You can see a little bit here about the sample size and the methodology. Here's what you really need to know. We weight the sample so that regardless of the raw numbers, when we process the research, we get an output that is representative of America with respect to geographic region, age, gender, household size, income, and certain types of ethnicities. The margin of error is plus or minus 2.5 percentage points, and you should keep that in mind as we look at some of that information. The nomenclature, there's a lot of prints here I'm not going to get into. I'm going to point simply 2 things out. First of all, you'll see in the upper right-hand corner, 50% plus 50% does not equal 100%. What does that mean? There's so much data in here, and it's so rich that you need to be very careful in looking at numbers and thinking what you know and making assumptions. Well, for example, we can ask people, where do you drink coffee? Do you drink coffee at home or away from home? And the answer could be yes. Yes, I drink it at home and away from home. Well, if chunks of people are saying, yes, I do this, and yes, I do that, and yes, I do that, you add them up and it looks like more than 100% of the research base. But that's the nature of the research that we're doing, some of the questions. And like I said, it's just something to keep in mind to avoid assumptions that would be easy to make, but might lead to misinterpretations in looking at the data. The other thing that I want to mention here is that this year, for the first time, we are specifically asking people about specialty coffee. Now, in earlier years, we used the expression gourmet coffee. That's really a legacy aspect of this survey. It's one of the valuable aspects of the survey. It's longitudinal, right? It goes over decades. But it also means that periodically we need to update things, tweak some of the language, and be mindful in case those tweaks or changes have an impact on the outcome. Now, this sort of begs the question, well, what exactly specialty? All of you as experts, you have a good, if not expert idea, scoring over 80 and certain attributes. Keep in mind that we're talking to American consumers, and therefore, we are not giving them a definition. We're not imposing one. We're asking them to tell us what they believe they're doing, what they're drinking, and how they're doing it. So let's start to look at the data a little bit and see what's happening out here. Overall, when we look at the numbers in January, we're looking at a small but not statistically relevant decline in overall coffee consumption. I think from my perspective, what's more interesting here is if you look over the last 10 years, you'll see these dips and these rises over the years. This really seems to be part of a normal pattern. I believe that this may be connected to people's economic situations, but we'll look at that question in particular, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. Looking at this from a different perspective, we're looking not just overall in terms of long-term trends, but just more recently and on a shorter-term basis. What have people been drinking over the past day and the past week? So again, similar to the long-term trends, we're seeing a bit of a softening overall in the coffee category, which again we can get into the reasons in a moment here. Now, as I did indicate, we're asking questions this time specifically with respect to specialty. And if you look at these numbers and you compare them overall to the trends, what it's safe to say is that specialty, or at least consumers' perceptions of specialty and what they're drinking, are not dropping off in a disproportionate way to the overall changes that we're seeing. Or to put this differently, specialty is holding its own despite the overall trends that we're seeing. Now, you can ask yourself this question: why is this, right? And this is where I think this research tends to get interesting, because it's one thing to ask people, are you drinking coffee or not? That's important. It's important to have that longitudinal data. But we also want to go a little more deeply. Why? What's happening? Unsurprisingly, when we ask people about their financial situation, right, we can see a marked measurable change in the number of people who are telling us that their financial situation is much worse or somewhat worse than it was previously. And so if we're thinking about coffee overall, if we're thinking about some of the treat aspects of coffee, some of the indulgences, the connection to the workplace, drinking coffee in the workplace, right? This would be consistent with a potential interpretation that the relatively short decline that we've seen in coffee is a result of the economic situation and what we see happening overall. If you look outside of this research for a moment, there's a lot of conversation overall about an economy that is ready to come roaring back. I don't want to be overly optimistic or Pollyanna, but if this linkage is correct, if this decline is related to the economic situation, and if the economic situation is going to come back, that definitely could be a cause for optimism. And again, we're looking at specialty here. I think what's interesting in this trend in particular is if you look back historically, you can see this increase in specialty. And so overall, we see these ups and downs as we saw in the longitudinal presentation. But again, with respect to specialty, it's been growing, it's increasingly significant, and it's holding its own. A time of day, I think what's interesting here, generally speaking, people are still drinking their coffee in the morning, no great surprise. What we did see is a bit of a decline in the afternoon. And again, this could be accounted for by the circumstances. Is that afternoon coffee typically something people are drinking out, they're with friends, they're in the workplace, is that an excuse to get away from their desk in the office? So perhaps it's unsurprising to see that afternoon drop off in terms of when and where. Again, no great surprise here. We're seeing a significant increase in at-home consumption. I think for me, the last bullet here was the real surprise that people who are traveling and commuting over the course of the pandemic, and perhaps these were truckers, first responders, and other people who, Uber drivers, people who had to be out and were out regardless, they're still out there drinking their coffee, commuting, and doing their thing. This question gets to the workplace question and connects once again to the economics of the pandemic and what's happening. We see here, for example, what's happening in terms of the workplaces with the coffee area. But I think, again, more interestingly, for those people that say they're using their coffee area less frequently, there are a number of reasons they can give us as to why they're drinking coffee in their workplace area less frequently. And if you want to be optimistic, I leave it to you to pick your own perspective here. A number of these answers are very interesting. For example, the third one, I'm buying coffee from coffee shops and cafes nearby instead of a workplace area. Perhaps there's a perception that that's safer rather than a communal coffee pot. Or I'm ordering coffee from shops and cafes, or I'm bringing something from home. So this is not necessarily signifying a disinterest in coffee, but an overall change in what people are doing and how they're doing it, driven by the pandemic. I mentioned a little bit earlier the things that are growing, low touch and grocery. Obviously, I think this issue of out of home and purchase through a drive-through, this is a very interesting number. It's certainly up, and I think this is obvious here. This is why, again, people are using their pandemic concerns to make their changes. But this is particularly interesting, and I think what this is showing us is that last fall, we saw an incredible use of increases in apps, and that has diminished somewhat into January. I think we're going to have to see how much of this remains. It would be interesting for us to learn more about this, and this is potentially an area of inquiry. Let's face it, managing all these outlets in a coffee shop, you've got people who are driving up and they're getting curbside service. They've got apps they're ordering and they're coming into the shop. They want the barriers and all the hygiene. Clearly, it's not very easy to manage all these things successfully, right? I mean, these are just a lot of balls to juggle in a time-critical way for something that's got to be served very quickly. Is this drop off in app ordering because consumers feel that it's not as an efficient way to get their coffee as they like? Is it because they feel more comfortable? It could well be because they feel more comfortable. We're going to call this pandemic fatigue. Keep in mind, this was back in January before the vaccine rollout really got going. We're going to look at some other indicators in a moment or two that might speak to this question of pandemic fatigue. Here we're looking at grocery and online. No surprise here for me, except the grocery stores. If you look at the cluster on the left, I think what's interesting is this increase that we're seeing in grocery. I was talking to some of my members earlier today, and they were telling me that the grocery channel just seems to be continuing to build. I think this speaks a little bit to questions about diversification, the extent that you're in multiple channels and able to deliver to consumers in multiple places. This also may be in relation to the fact that a curbside ordering or curbside pickup of groceries has really come on strong over the last couple of months. And so this may be making consumers even more comfortable with that grocery outlet than they were before. Certainly one of the opportunities, we have heard from consumers that they've been trying different things at home. And here are a couple of examples. They're trying new ground coffees or single serve coffees. Is this going to be temporary? Is this going to be sticky? It's hard to say, but it does suggest that, again, this question of communication, education, taking the opportunity, maybe just changing it up again and saying, hey, you tried some new things, come on back, we've got some new things, is another opportunity. I mentioned perceptions and claims. Let's talk about this a little bit. For me, this is always one of the more interesting aspects of the research that we do. I've highlighted a couple of boxes here. Coffee wakes me up and gets me going. So perceptions and claims. How do people feel? What are they thinking about their coffee? And as you can see, from 2019 to 2020 to 2021, very, very little change here, right? If you think back to the top of this presentation, I mentioned that the margin of error was 2.5 percentage points. On this item in particular, these fluctuations year to year are within the margin of error. But what I thought was interesting is if you come down a little bit and you look at the mental focus question, you can see a marked increase in the number of people who say they agree completely with the idea that coffee improves their mental focus. We should also look at the next two boxes about the health benefits. Not really meaningful change in the first one, a bit more in the second one. What's interesting here is this is an effort that we all continue to struggle with, and that is there is an overwhelming amount of information, independent, and I want to stress independent, on industry research about the health benefits of drinking coffee. Yet no matter how often we talk to the media, we talk to consumers, we get the word out, the headlines are out there continue to be, I would say, a lack of appreciation on the part of consumers about coffee and health. This may be because of consumers' conflicted relationship with caffeine. They love that caffeine in the morning. You can see at the top, coffee wakes me up and gets me going. And if they can't sleep at night because they're worried about whatever it is they're worried about, they can't shut their head off, one of the things that may pop into their head is, I shouldn't have had all that coffee today. So when I mentioned earlier that there may be opportunities for education, communication, this is the type of thing that I think would give folks an opportunity to reflect upon it. And one has to be careful in communicating health messages. You can't overpromise or overstep the FDA regulations. But I think from my perspective, this speaks to opportunity. Here's another look at this question. And as I mentioned, I find all this to be terribly interesting. What's interesting here is you got the people saying coffee is good for my health. Okay, and this is, I agree somewhat, I agree completely. And you look at these numbers, and then you look at the number of people who disagree, and it's almost as if consumers don't know what to think. It's like almost an equal percentage are like, yeah, it's good for me. No, it's not good for me. Well, the evidence is really clear. Within moderation, given that you may have some sensitivities, coffee is good. So this just tells us that we all have a lot of work to do, and this may be a really good time to do some of that work. I want to talk a little bit more about these perceptions and claims, and something that is certainly top of mind for all of us right now, but especially those of us in the specialty arena, and that is farmer livelihoods. I mentioned at the top of this, we're all suffering through this, but certainly people in disadvantaged communities and developing nations, they're suffering even more than the rest of us. And what's interesting here is if you look at these numbers, you see a decrease in the number of consumers that say these things are important to them. I mean, the question in particular, you can see the question over there, right? Is this going to make you more likely, somewhat more likely, not at all likely to buy the coffee if you know that coffee is grown on farms that are treating workers well, or that's being grown in an environmentally sustainable way? I think the key thing here, from my perspective, is not that these things are less important. I think the key thing here is exactly the opposite, is that this is a moment, again, to communicate and educate about why these things are especially important. We can talk about the pandemic and connect it to coffee. The conversation, one of the conversations we're having as a country, what is our responsibility, our obligation to help others in the world get access to vaccines and to address their public health situations. And one perspective is, well, that's not here. We don't have a lot of responsibility. But here's what the epidemiologists would say. Of course we do, because an unchecked epidemic anywhere leads to further variations in the virus, and it threatens us here. So there's a lot of reasons to say that this does not mean that these things are less important, but they're more important. And engage in a conversation with your customers and to make clear why these are your core values and you're sticking with them. I do want to drop to the bottom of this, and I want to make sure you don't miss this. I don't want anyone to be upset. Robustness certainly has its place in the world, and we know that, and we love it. But I think it's interesting that when we ask consumers, how much more likely would you be to buy a coffee if you knew it was made with 100% Robusta beans? There's a bunch of people that say they'd be more likely to buy that coffee. And I suspect here too, there's an opportunity for communication and education. So this is the big picture in terms of perceptions, claims, things that we have tracked over the years. But as I said at the top of this presentation, the real tough question that we're going to be faced with is, how do we get that 30% of the population back? The chunk of coffee drinkers who said, not until after the pandemic am I going to be ready to come back to a coffee shop and drink coffee. And I mean, is there ever going to be after the pandemic? So let's look at some of these numbers and what people are telling us about this. And let's go more deeply into specifically this question of a retail reboot in coffee after COVID, or in the age of COVID. This is the baseline, right? This is the baseline question set, and this is how we get to the 32, 31%. There's a slight decrease if you look at the bottom overall from 32% to 31%. That's not really statistically meaningful, but we are seeing more people saying the next couple of months, I'd be willing to come back. And if you look at in the next 2 to 3 months, in the next 4 months, the dark green bar, that's the more recent data. And you see between the two of those, they've gone up about 5 points or so. And now, of course, we're asking questions. Well, what exactly is it that will get you back? What can you do to come back? So as you see in the green box up there, I think what's interesting is in a lot of these areas, you see a decrease in the interest on the part of respondents. So let's just take the first question as an example. 48% of respondents back in September said that if food servers were wearing gloves or masks, I'd be more likely to come back. That's dropped 5 percentage points. Right? So if you look down the responses here, if they make everybody wear a mask, if they follow sanitation protocols, drop. In just about every one of these cases, the respondents are saying, man, that's not so much of an issue anymore. I think what is interesting is if you look at the other, the famous other response, about a third from the bottom, that's up 3 points. Now, again, not wildly significant here, but perhaps it's an indication that the other could be what? Vaccinations, changes in the overall environment in my community. So it's not particularly easy to interpret exactly what we're seeing here with respect to the changes, but it does give you a lot of indication of the types of things people are looking for. I mean, let's face it, 43% of consumers, that's still a big chunk of folks to be thinking about in terms of coaxing people back. Now, here's the really good news. I mean, the really, really good news. People miss their coffee shops. 35%. I miss somewhat, strongly somewhat, I miss being there. I miss treating myself. I've remained loyal. Things aren't quite the same. I can't get what I want. So there's a lot of reason here to be speaking to this cohort and saying, hey, we know you've missed us. We've missed you too. Come on back. and then maybe connecting that to some of the other things that we saw earlier. That's really the snapshot into this state. I wanted to take just about 2 minutes and talk a little more about the data generally and some resources that we have available for you in case they might be of use as you think about this retail reboot. One of the things that we've done with this research this year is we've developed a new online dashboard. So if you subscribe to the research, you get all this information on the reports, but you also get access to an online database and you can cut your own reports. You can jump in to pre-established reports. You can select certain kinds of slicers, if you will, or qualifiers. One of the interesting things about the data, we actually collect data not just on adults over the age of 18, but people between the ages of 13 and 17. We do not include that in the overall research for a number of reasons that don't matter right now, but that's something that you're interested in. That's in the research as well. You can drop into the special modules. You can instantly get returns that cut things by region, by age, by income, by gender, and you can really go crazy with that tool. This is just one aspect of what we do. As I mentioned, and as Peter touched on, one of the things we have available for you, and I encourage you to visit the website, take these resources. We have a reopening guide. Even if you are open, this is something you can download. There's a guide to best practices. This is based on CDC guidance. We had an industrial hygienist look at this. There are some posters you can put up in your retail environment. You do have to register, but then you can download everything. It won't cost you anything because after all, we're all interested in seeing this reboot go well, and everyone from the farmers that we rely upon to our entire community getting back in gear and finding whatever our new normal looks like. So that's all I've got in terms of preparation. I do think we have a little time. Once again, I want to thank all of you. There is one more thank you. We do this research through an outside research company. They're called Dig Research, as dig into the numbers. The lead researcher is a woman named Cheryl Hong, and she's just absolutely incredible. So I don't think she's here with us, but a big shout out to Cheryl and the people at Dig for their hard work to make my job look easy. So thank you all.
Thank you. Speaking of making it look easy, thank you, Bill, for that. That was a wonderful, sort of 35-minute tour de force of like some really complex things. So thank you for communicating it so clearly. And I just wanted to say that I've been able to look through more deeply through the data. The report that you all publish is, of course, immense and full of stuff, as well as the database that you just referred to. And really, it's I would really recommend to everybody. You can go to the National Coffee Association website and see how to purchase that and gain access to all those other things that Bill just talked about. One of the things that you touched on in the report is that you spent a little bit more time documenting this increase in at-home consumption of coffee, and you guys have done a fantastic job, really showing that despite our worst fears, overall coffee consumption has stayed very stable this year. It's just that the venue of consumption has shifted. And largely, of course, to the home. And you showed in your report increase in purchases of home coffee brewing equipment, for example. That's really interesting as we start to imagine people making that 30% of people that you kept going back to who are making decisions about coming back to the coffee shops. Do you have any intuitions about consumer behaviors around that, they've bought a new coffee maker during the pandemic. They've found a source of beans. What do you feel like, and these are people that might have been 7-day-a-week coffee shop patrons, in 2019. So what's your intuition about how that'll sort of play out?
Yeah. I think there's a couple of things. I think there is the potential to bring consumption back up. I mean, when we look on a global basis, we know, first of all, consumption is off slightly in this country. So we have the opportunity to get back up to where we are. And then we always like to compare ourselves to certain places in Scandinavia. Like, oh my gosh, we could all be drinking 6 more cups of coffee a day. Mm-hmm. And the reason I mention this is what I would like to think is the people that have brought these very fancy machines into their homes, that this helps take them deeper into coffee. It drives a deeper appreciation for the origin of their coffee, for the flavor notes in their coffee, and it becomes complementary to the rest of the experience. If you look at what people are telling us about what they're missing that social interaction and in a coffee context. And what I would like to think is that somebody who puts in that cool machine is still going to go to their coffee shop and talk to their barista and say, hey, I've got that machine at home. I couldn't make it exactly like you, or I'm doing this. And it ends up at the end of the day with a customer who's drinking more in different places. I don't necessarily see it as permanently displacing anything, quite frankly.
Okay, very good. We've got a question from the chat. How has the pandemic impacted preferred methods of preparation? I saw the slide about consumers trying new things, but how has preparation shifted? More or less espresso, more or less brewed drip, more or less cold brew, cold coffee, etc.
Yeah, the great question. This is going to be fun because there's like 200 pages of data in there, and it's going to be sort of like stump the guy. I should look through my report. Here's what I can tell you. Perhaps unsurprisingly, when you think about things overall, the type of beverage and related to the preparation is fewer espresso-based beverages. And I think this is directly related, Peter, to what you just said a moment ago. People tend not to have espresso machines at home. And so you see this move away from the cappuccinos and lattes because they don't have the equipment. They're reverting to ground coffee or a pod or a single. And I think there's a direct correlation between the equipment or the lack of equipment, the change in the preparations, the opportunity for equipment manufacturers to sell more high-end machines. And that takes us back to where you were a second ago, Peter. What's the long-term impact on it? I do think once people are back in their coffee shops, they're going to be back to their espresso-based beverages. And this also, would be a motivating factor to get people back into the shop. Haven't you missed your latte? We've missed you a latte too. Sorry.
You should be in marketing. They mentioned cold coffee. You all have been really good, I think, about documenting consumer interest in cold coffee and cold brewed coffee. You guys have done a number of reports around that. And then, you also mentioned that this idea about doing multiple research projects per year. And I know one of the motivations for that is to capture some of the interest in cold brewed coffee that happens during the summertime. Can you talk about that? I mean, it seems like cold coffee and cold brewed coffee are a trend that precedes COVID, but may sort of be engaged with it in some way too.
Yes.
Any thoughts about that?
Yeah. I tell you, my first thought, Peter, is I love the questions because you're really getting to core issues here. So the answer to the first half of your question is yes. In other words, we traditionally have put this research in the field in January. And one of the things that we're hoping to capture by doing a second wave in August is to see the impact on cold coffee, cold drinks, related beverages, and to see how those numbers might be different given the seasonality and what we might be thinking. I mean, I will say, and this is just a bit of personal trivia, I worked my way through college working in a convenience store on the overnight shift in Pennsylvania. And it was so weird. Like, people would come in and buy ice cream, like 2 scoops of ice cream, like in the dead of winter. And I just never understood it personally. So I think that's what's cool about the research is the research takes us away from personal anecdotes like I just gave, and it takes us into what's really happening. But I think there's a second part to the question here, and that's perhaps the most perceptive part. You're absolutely right. That building wave of cold brew predated the pandemic. But here's how it related to the pandemic. So much of that was in a grab and go type of environment. You're in the convenience store, speaking of convenience stores, and you're on the way from here to there. And you pick up a couple of bottles and you toss them in your backpack and you take them with you. Well, if you're locked up in your house, you're not grabbing and going on the run ready to drink beverages that you can enjoy at any point during your day. We certainly saw in this research report, we start out, I didn't show this, but we start out overall looking at all types of beverages, sodas and juices and tea, and we put that in a big grid, and then we drill into coffee. So really the baseline is, did you drink something yesterday other than tap water? And if you did, then you qualify as a consumer for this research. So if you go back and you look into the pandemic, very steep declines in soda consumption, in juice consumption, and separate and apart from overall historical trends that people have been concerned about those types of beverages. And so we attribute it to the lockdown. You're not out, you can't grab it, you can't go it. Conversely, right, if people get out on their way of grabbing or popping in their shop more easily, I would expect we'll see those numbers go right back up to pre-pandemic levels.
Another thing that this conversation brings to mind that we saw in some research that we did with Square early in the pandemic was the innovation of the cold brew growler. A big glass bottle full of cold coffee. And that's something that doesn't work as well. I mean, it's possible to do a bulk kind of hot coffee thing, but it reminded that major pivot that a lot of retailers did reminded me that if you're doing cold curbside or delivery, they're sort of cold beverages are more, it's easier to deal with a cold beverage sometimes than a hot one. Mm-hmm. And, I can imagine getting a cold beverage home and it still being in the right temperature to enjoy it than maybe a hot one because it cools off, and there may be something there. And anyway, it's something this way that pre-existing trends interacted with the major disruptive event of the COVID thing is, I think, going to be interesting.
Peter, I think you're exactly right. And one of the other things that I love about coffee is how it connects us to so many different things all over the world and the interconnectivity between things. And here's what I mean. On the one hand, we're hyper aware of sustainability issues, of environmental issues, of climate change issues. And as a community, we want to be part of the solution. On the other hand, we're looking at a moment, and you're mentioning refillable growlers. We're looking at a moment where personal safety and hygiene and disposability and individual serving packets of ketchup are now something that are topmost in consumers' minds because they're concerned about their personal safety. I don't think we know enough to see how these issues resolve. But I think for me, the key here is, like the issue about farmer livelihoods, consumers may shift their focus to personal safety versus a disposability. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't stay focused and try to rebalance these things, either because from a business perspective we're interested, but more importantly because our core values connect these things and they're important to who we are and who we want to be as a sector.
There's another question in the chat about switching brands, willingness to switch brands. Is there any, do you have any indication about consumers' willingness to switch brands? And if so, is that driven by trying to kind of trading down and trying to, be more economical, or is it driven by people wanting to try new things?
Yeah, I think it's mostly the latter, to be honest. We did not run the cross tabs, and I think that would be a really interesting way to look at this data. In other words, what I would want to do is take that subset of people who said that their financial situation is much worse than it was. That was 24% of respondents, right? And then I would want to look at that against a number of people who see that they tried something new, and see if the majority of those people were self-reporting as worse off or better. But we have not done that analysis. So while I apologize for not answering your question, I appreciate the idea and the thought, and we'll look at that and see.
And that's the sort of stuff that you could get into the database and kind of do yourself, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's certain preset areas, but a lot of this you can just jump into and start to tweak some of that stuff. You can ask the question and then re-ask the question based upon a subset of cross indicators. So.
That's really powerful, and that's a new innovation for this year. That's an amazingly powerful way to answer some of these questions that people have. This may be another one of those questions, but I'll ask it anyway. Is there any price group of coffee that seems to be disproportionately affected, for better or for worse? I think what they're getting at is like super expensive coffees where they, or inexpensive coffees. Does there seem to be a disproportionate effect on these price groups?
Yeah, we don't ask any information about pricing at all. There are researchers that are out there that do that, but we don't ask people how much they pay or the averages or anything. We simply ask about their economic situation. And really, I guess it's a philosophical perspective here at the association. There's a lot of companies in our community, and pricing strategy, it has both legal implications, antitrust concerns, as well as really strong competitive undertones, which is a long way of saying we don't look at it. I don't know, but there's a reason we don't look at it. So,
okay. One last question here, and it is consumer interest in organic versus non-organic, and the willingness to pay a premium for organic. What's your sense of the interest in organic coffee over time?
Yeah, my sense that in the most recent research, and I don't want to go back and double check that, is like these other equities or perceptions or claims, there's generally been a reduction in consumers saying this thing or that thing or the other thing are important to me. It's not been statistically really meaningful. So it's probably more people just focus on other things right now. And I don't think it's a disruption of the trend. Overall, we have seen this growing interest in organic, and I do think it's still got future potential. Again, I can't stress enough on each of these things. There are these educational opportunities. I mean, the questions we get at the association from consumers, they surprise you sometimes. People just asking things, and you can tell by the type of question they're asking, they don't have a real good sense of where coffee comes from or what's involved. So slight reduction, big potential, strong interest, educational opportunity.
Great. Well, thanks again for the insights and the deep dive into this. This is like super valuable, and I appreciate your time and in sharing it with us. And furthermore, I think I can speak for the whole coffee community in thanking the NCA for being so persistent about this. I mean, the longitude of this study, the length of time that this has been happening, gives us these amazing insights over time into trends, and that's something that's just so unique in the coffee industry, and I'm just so grateful for it.
Peter,
So
you've been a great partner over the years. We didn't end up on a RICO stage together like we have in prior years, but it's always great to work with you. So thank you.
great, thank you, Bill. Okay, well, that is it for the for this issue. Bill just mentioned RICO, that we're going to be starting to discuss many of these shifts that will happen in the coffee market because of COVID and other things. At RICO, we'd like to invite you to join us. Bill, we'd love to invite you as well to join us, and we're looking forward to that. Meanwhile, I'll log off now and give you a chance to grab a cup of coffee or a snack before the next session starts at 1 p.m. Pacific. So thank you again to Bill and the National Coffee Association, and thank you all of the sponsors that you see here for their support, and we look forward to engaging you the rest of the day. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.